Namaskar and good evening, everybody. Team Hingori Sutras welcomes you to In Conversation with Arijit Ray. The month of March has been dedicated to matters of the mind. Do the matters of the mind matter to the matter of the mind? Is that a tongue twister or a mind twister? But if you stop for a moment and think deeply, the matters of the mind matter to the matter of the mind. Inspired I am today by my fellow admin, a writer, speaker, coach, Arijit Ray. He is a marketing and advertising professional with close to 30 years of experience, 6 years as an entrepreneur. After working with blue chip multinational agencies, he moved on from DDB Mudra to become one of the youngest CEO of Dentsu Incorporation Tokyo at Dentsu India. He then started his own entrepreneurial venture, Paperboat Brandworks, in 2015. At the Unlock Company, in addition to helping marketers unlock their marketing problems with creative communication solutions, Arijit and his team work closely with organizations to help their employees unlock their full productive potential by exposing them to the tremendously powerful and practical philosophy available in the Bhagavad Gita and the teachings of various saints that literally cover all aspects of our lives. Arijit is also a regular feature writer for Economic Times, Brand Equity, Business Standard, Financial Express, Business World, Speaking Tree, and many more. Arijit has delivered various lectures on different aspects of spirituality and mind management at various forums. And before I confuse you and myself any further in matters of the mind, let me hand over the reins to our guest speaker, Arijit Ray. Let's together, dear audience, understand from him what we need to do to transcend the mind. A very warm welcome to you, Arijit. आपका बहुत बहुत स्वागत है.
Thank you so much, Anjali. That was a very nice introduction, rather long one. Thank you, Arjun, for bringing me onto the Hingori Sutra platform. Thank you, Anjali, for those lovely videos. Would look forward to actually interacting with all of you over the next hour or so. In today's session, we will actually try to decode what spirituality means to all of us in our practical lives. Religion and spirituality, lots of time, is misunderstood and subject to lots of loose interpretations. But the truth is actually eternal, and that cannot be compromised. Now, what we'll try and do today is try and understand why is it so difficult sometimes to bring in the concepts that we hear about, talk about, into our lives as a reality. What are some of the stumbling blocks and obstacles that are produced from our own minds, and what are some of the practices that we can adopt towards bringing peace, calm, and fulfillment on a slightly more sustained basis? Swami Vivekananda used to say that we are spiritual beings living a human life. Now, all of us know, many of you probably know, that we have actually emerged from the infinite Brahman. We are resting today as an individual body-mind complex. And all of our final journey is when we actually merge back into the infinite Brahman. Now, the infinite consciousness today is actually trapped in what we call the genetically limited body-mind individual. Now, this whole phenomenon in the Upanishads is called Chit Jara Granthi, the interlocking of the Jara, which is matter, which is mind, and the infinite consciousness, which also means that the consciousness is actually trapped or caged in this human body-mind system. And the process through which we are actually able to extricate this infinite consciousness from the narrow individual mind is spirituality. In other words, expansion of the genetically limited individual to an expansive personality is the science of religion and spirituality. Swami Ranganathananda Maharaj, who was the 13th president of the Ramakrishna Mission, used to say, he actually used to quote the British Prime Minister of the 30s, Disraeli, who used to say, modern society has mistaken comfort for civilization. The more gadgets we have, the more comfortable we are and more civilized we are. Now, this notion actually doesn't take into account a very, very fundamental premise, which is the inner growth of man. So the questions we have to ask ourselves is, are we growing from within? Do we have compassion for others? Do we have, are we growing spiritually? Is that psychosocial evolution? And psychosocial evolution is the need of the hour. And Swami Ranganathananda says, organic evolution has no meaning at all unless we are feeling that feeling of oneness and love. So he quotes Bertrand Russell, who had said, a little love must come in the human heart. Then our problems will be solved easily. So we can also define spirituality as the journey from being selfish to progressively becoming unselfish. Now, it might be pertinent to ask, why is this journey from selfishness to unselfishness so arduous? So we actually find the answer in another definition of spirituality approached from a slightly different perspective. Now, in the Patanjali Yoga Sutras, yoga is defined as yogasya chitta vritti nirodha, which means cessation or stopping of the endless vibrations of the mind. We know what endless vibration of the minds, right? We are actually experiencing it every day. Now, chitta means mind, and vritta means the modifications of the mind that are caused by the emotions that hit at us, the waves of emotions. Now, our minds, we all understand, are in a constant, always in a constant state of fluctuations. Even the smallest stimuli from the outside world actually sets off a wave of emotions, and we get swept, we get destabilized, we get shaken from our original position of equilibrium. So, in spite of our best intention, lots of times we are actually unable to generate the will, the intent, and the conviction to translate that vision into practice in our real lives. Swami Vivekananda says, religion is not in books, not in theories, nor in dogmas, nor in talking, not even in reasoning. It is being and becoming. My children, the secret of religion lies not in theories, but in practice. To be good and to do good, that is the whole of religion. Religions of the world have become lifeless mockeries. What the world wants today is character. 1 ounce of practice is worth 1,000 pounds of theory. He goes on to talk about a beautiful metaphor about experience, and he says, you cannot satisfy my curiosity to see a country by showing me a map. I must have actual experience. Maps only create curiosity in us to get more and more perfect knowledge. Beyond that, they have no value whatsoever. Clinging to books only degenerates the human mind. So finally, the final definition of spirituality is realization. Now, this realization word also is misunderstood and misinterpreted. But realization simply means that bringing to reality, making all the concepts, all the constructs, all the philosophies we learn real and a reality in our lives. Now, a person, who is serious about seeking that spiritual life, a person who actually wants to integrate the materialistic aspirations and the spiritual aspirations in this life, that person has to constantly kind of put him or herself under the lens of evaluation, which means that we have to constantly ask ourselves when we are talking about spirituality, we have to constantly ask ourselves this question, that are we becoming magnanimous? Are we feeling for others? Are we becoming charitable? Are we becoming more grateful? Are we becoming stronger? Can we resist the wrong? Are we becoming calm? Are we becoming less restless? Are we becoming less instinctive? Or are we still getting dislodged from our peace very easily? Do we react and get angry at the snap of our fingers? Do we have very strong notions of what is right and what is wrong? Are we still hurt very easily? Are we still very sentimental? Now, I'm sure a lot of us are making some progress, and it is also true that many of us are not being able to make the right kind of progress in spite of having a very good intent of turning spiritual. So let us try and analyze, why do we find it difficult to bring into our lives a conscious spiritual practice? Why is there a constant struggle? Now, Sri Ramakrishna Paramahansa, the avatara of this age, did not have a formal education, but he used to talk about the highest teachings of the Vedas and the Upanishads through beautiful, simple metaphors. Now, whenever he kind of observed anything in life in front of him, he would actually kind of relate it to God realization. And the Gospel of Ramakrishna is actually a collection of these beautiful metaphors. So I will talk about two things actually. He's talked about why householders or people who are in the sansaras, they find it very difficult to achieve that spiritual progress. And I will try and anchor the discussion over these two phenomena. He said, worldly people chant the name of God, but there is no zeal behind it. They have no grit. If they succeed in an undertaking, it is all right. But if they don't succeed, it scarcely bothers them at all. When they need water, they begin to dig a well, but as soon as they strike a stone, they give up digging there and begin at another place. Perhaps they come to a bed of sand, finding nothing but sand, they give that place up too. How can they succeed in getting water unless they continue to dig persistently where they started? So it talks about the lack of perseverance in a lot of us, and that kind of drags us down. The next metaphor that he uses is once again a beautiful metaphor. It kind of compares a farmer bringing water into the field. And he says, constantly, you have to chant the name and glories of God and give up worldly thoughts as much as you can. With the greatest effort, you may try to bring water into a field for your crops, but it may all leak out through the ridges. Then, all your efforts to bring the water by digging a canal will be futile. You will feel restless for God when your heart becomes pure and your mind free from attachment to the things of the world. Then alone will your prayer reach God. He further uses another beautiful analogy as if it's kind of straight, taken from the modern parlance where we actually face network issues. He says, a telegraph wire cannot carry messages if it has a break or some other defect. Now, we will try and understand why we cannot persevere, why we cannot bring into our lives perseverance, and why do we fall prey to this constant state where we are kind of affected by worldliness and attachment. It is very simple that we don't have this quality of Shraddha. When we define Shraddha, Shraddha is nothing but Satya Nishtha, a tremendous conviction, a deep conviction about the goal of spiritual realization in this case. Or if we've heard about something, if we know what is the truth, how do we bring into our lives the practice to kind of realize that truth in our lives? We don't have the conviction because our purpose is muzzled. Our purpose itself is diluted because we want to be spiritual, we want peace, we want fulfillment, we want enduring happiness, but we want all the sensory attractions, all the worldly pursuits are also there in our wish list. So we want the retirement home. We want to save for those 2 international holidays till we are 70, 75. We want to upgrade the car every 2 years. We want the latest pens and the latest gadgets. We also want spirituality. And so finally, spirituality becomes, we also want spirituality. Now, there is no problem in the worldly pursuits. Our worldly pursuits, our materialistic aspirations are absolutely valid, and they can go hand in hand with our spiritual aspirations. But the problem is, it can't go on without developing a firm conviction in our path to realize our human potential. When we do that, what we get is unfulfillment. Now, the reason why we are not being able to develop the conviction is because the whole concept of success that we have borrowed from society is itself flawed. It essentially is linked to a person's rise on the corporate ladder. That pretty much dictates his standing in society, the recognition, the status, and everything. Now, when our measure of success is derived only from our corporate avatars, even a little disruption in our work life affects our balance. This impacts our personal spheres and it has a reverse impact on our professional lives. And this vicious cycle continues. So, wherever we are in our personal lives or our professional lives, we are not being able to manifest that intensity of purpose. The fact that human life is precious and we need that overriding purpose often gets lost. Often we realize that we are actually chasing a mirage, but we just don't have the knowledge or the wherewithal to come out of this spiral. Bhagavan Adi Shankaracharya of the 8th century AD emphasizes the rare and unique privilege of the human birth. He says, Jantunam Nara Durlabham. He captures the deep implications of the infinite possibilities hidden in every human being. The fact that we are the only organic species which has the capacity to explore both our outer and inner worlds. But the unfortunate reality is that we spend every moment of our lives undertaking the journey outside, but we do precious little to visit the beautiful world in the depths of our personality. Swami Vivekananda, talking about the goal of man, says, pleasure is not the goal of man, but knowledge. After a certain time, man finds that it is not happiness, but knowledge towards which he is going, and that both pleasure and pain are great teachers. It's your outlook that matters. It is your own mental attitude that makes the world what it is for us. Our thoughts make things beautiful. Our thoughts make things ugly. The whole world is in our minds. Learn to see things in proper light. So, what he says here is that he emphasizes the importance of an organized thought world and the fact that our thoughts itself color our vision. And he's also talking about the fact that this is spiritual knowledge that takes us beyond the realms of happiness and misery, the knowledge that helps us experience fulfillment on a slightly more sustainable basis. Now, this orientation is extremely important. This background knowledge is of paramount value. The fact that we need to be good human beings, the fact that no matter what, we cannot compromise on these principles. And when these principles are crystallized in our very being, it's kind of etched in our hearts, imprinted in our personalities, we actually build that bedrock, much important foundation of our spiritual life. And when we build the bedrock, when the long-term vision is set, we now know the path is set and we can stay the course. Nothing can shake us from that foundation. Most importantly, all our materialistic aspirations can actually happen, and they're realized within our value systems, well aligned to our value systems. And most importantly, from the context of our day-to-day lives, our regular lives, what happens is the short-term impediments, the setbacks, which used to bother us a lot now, won't bother us to that extent because we would have raised our minds to a different level. So I'll quickly do a recap of what we've spoken so far. Spirituality is the journey from selfishness to unselfishness. It's about being and becoming, about experience. Doctrines, dogmas, and theories don't matter much. We find it very difficult to implement in our lives because our minds are always in a state of flux. We don't have perseverance. And because we don't have perseverance because for attachment and desires, they leak out of the system. We can't persevere because we don't have the conviction. We don't have the conviction because our concept of success itself is flawed. We also spoke about birth in a human body is a rare privilege, and we need to be aware that to realize our human potential can be and is the highest purpose. So ultimately, we seek that spiritual orientation so that we can get some sort of a balance in our lives, balance of thoughts, balance of our actions, balance of our reactions, balance of our emotions, and balance in the way we consume the things of the world. So if we look, let's now look at what are the causes that cause our minds to be in a constant state of fluctuations and therefore disturb the balance that we all seek. The Patanjali Yoga Sutra talks about few barriers, obstacles, afflictions, or kleshas that prevent us from realizing our spiritual potential. One simple word, it's actually amazing. Likes and dislikes is has such a tremendous impact on our personality. This word is in Sanskrit, it's called raga and dvesha. Now, from childhood, our various associations through the friends we make, the habits, we actually develop very demarcated comfort zones. From this comfort zone springs our taste, the kind of food we like, the kind of movies we want to go to, the kind of gadgets we want to own, the kind of people we want to hang around with, the kind of conversations we want to make. And this is called raga because whatever we start liking, we start getting attracted to it. Now, with time, they actually take a very, very firm hold of our mind. Anything that is outside this carefully crafted comfort zone, we actually start hating. We start getting repulsed from it. And this is called dvesha. And this is the genesis of something we called a conditioned mindset. In the Bhagavad Gita, Lord Sri Krishna actually cautions Arjuna about the danger of these two emotions. He says, Indriya sarthe raga dvesha vyavasthitau tayor navashama gacche tau hasya paripanthinau. He says Indriya and Indriya sarthe are two words which is the sense and sense objects. The shloka is saying that our human system is established in the sensory world through these two emotions, raga and dvesha. If the experience is pleasant, we welcome it. If the experience is not unpleasant, we actually run away from it. And then this shloka, it says, Tayor navashama gache tau hasya paripanthinau. It says, don't fall into their clutches. They are actually well known as one's highway robbers. And what do the highway robbers rob us from? It robs us from our discrimination, our knowledge, and wisdom. So we should not be controlled by them. Now, these emotions have a tremendous impact on our personality. We lose the objectivity, we become rigid, we cannot take alternative point of views, and our bias starts reflecting in the way we speak and the way we react. Our ability to adapt and adjust is seriously compromised. The result is conflict. We see this happening in all spheres, our offices, homes, and WhatsApp. So typically, actually, WhatsApp has now become the third home. There are people, all of us, we know that many of us actually spend 3, 4, 5 hours together in WhatsApp conversations. The other day, actually, I was noticing that in a particular WhatsApp group, there were a couple of people who were actually jumping from one WhatsApp conversation, one WhatsApp chain to the other. And from about 11 a.m. to 4 o'clock, they were constantly on those WhatsApp chain of WhatsApp conversations. Now, what we do in WhatsApp is that we actually relentlessly expressing our point of views. And the more we argue, the more we get into conflicts, the more we actually vitiate our internal environment. So conflict has become a very light word because we are actually getting into a war situation every day in our lives. These are actually when something creates such a tremendous impact in our mind, we don't like somebody saying it is actually nothing less than a war. It is an onslaught in our mental system. Now we have to learn from the culture. Now in the Mahabharata, we understood the great lengths that Lord Shri Krishna went to avoid the war, the great lengths Lord Shri Krishna went to maintain peace. When the Pandavas came back from the forest, the Kauravas were actually supposed to return half the kingdom, but they refused to do that. So the war was actually looming. At that point of time, Lord Shri Krishna told the Pandavas that I will actually become an ambassador of the Pandavas and go to the Kauravas and try and see if I can prevent the war. So he goes to the Kaurava court and talks to them and tells them, why don't you return half the kingdom as promised, and the war will not take place. Finally, after a series of offers, obviously Duryodhana refuses it. After a series of offers, Lord Krishna says, why don't you give the Pandavas just one village and they will live in it? And Duryodhana says that we will not give them one point of a needle. So the example is that, see, when it goes out of control, a war cannot be avoided. The war will happen, fight will happen, conflicts will happen sometimes when situation cannot be avoided. But the impetus should be on trying to maintain peace at all costs and not to get into a warlike situation on a simple WhatsApp conversation. Now, when this conditioning within our minds becomes intense and our sensory associations are unrestrained, we create actually what we call a whirlpool of emotions within us. From these emotions actually spring desires of various forms, lifestyle related in the workplace in the forms of ambition, sometimes realistic, sometimes unrealistic, desire for associations, desire for status, desire for another person's downfall. And the more we entertain them, the more we actually fan them. And when some of these desires are throttled, we cannot accept them. The reaction is anger. Now, the Bhagavad Gita once again has a beautiful shloka on the combination of krodha and anger, which is uh, kama and krodha. The lack of time, I can't talk about it right now, but probably at some other. Now, the other thing, other klesha, and the other uh, obstruction or bottleneck that kind of drags us down is our ego centered attitude. It's called, yeah. For everything for us is actually governed by our identification with our society provided identity. We are so attached to it that our reactions, our evaluation of situations, people are all dependent on what we feel about ourselves. The pride, the arrogance about our own status makes us extremely individual centered. So much so that this me first attitude becomes a second nature. Now, when this me first attitude becomes our second nature, we actually alienate ourselves and we cannot form that collective vision. We become trapped by a narrow, self centered, restricted vision. And from this deep sense of entitlement comes a deeper associations with our designations, with our relationships, our clothes, our gadgets, our cars, our material possessions, our knowledge, and even our intellectual capabilities. So, stronger the I sense, stronger the arrogance, stronger the sense of mine, the I and the mine, the my car, my house, my body, my intellect, my position. Now, let's look at what are when some of these things, this ego centered mindset, when the conditioned mindset becomes a natural strain in our life, when an uncontemplative or a compulsive life becomes our core attitude in our life, what is the kind of lifestyle it translates to? We actually start living for ourselves, a family of four and no more, which means that in our lives, we lack the social orientation, the ability to think about others. What happens is that when we seek everything from the outside world constantly, this constant seeking puts us in a constant state of perpetual restlessness. And conditioning and self centeredness creates very, very strong attachment. And from these attachment, we develop very high degrees of possessiveness and expectations. So finally, what happens is that we move through our life to a great degree of compulsiveness. And with this, instinctiveness becomes the bane of life. When anything comes from the outside world in terms of a stimulus or in terms of a situation, our reactions are always knee jerk and uncontrolled. And finally, it happens because that we don't spend enough time pausing and reflecting on the various situations of our lives. And when this mindset kind of moves into the corporate avatar, when we kind of deal with a situation where a leader is ego centered, what happens? We see that there's too much involvement and too much identification with the roles that he's performing. As a result, what happens is we become rigid, we cannot adapt, we create our own fiefdoms, and the focus becomes completely individualistic. the collective vision suffers, and what happens in these organizations is that my way or the highway becomes the attitude. Finally, as a result of all this, we stifle productivity and we take away from the environment the much needed cohesiveness on which an organization actually should run. So, what finally happens is that we are governed by our wants that are constantly multiplying. We keep devoting ourselves to meet our sensory cravings, and we don't use the wonderful capacity to discriminate, to think, to pause, and to reflect on what is actually the purpose of our lives. Swami Vivekananda, talking about this mindset, talks about says that I pity them. It is not their fault. Their children, veritable children, though they may be great and high in society, their eyes are nothing beyond their little horizon of a few yards. The routine work, eating, drinking, earning, and begetting, following each other in mathematical precision. They know nothing beyond happy little souls. Their sleep is never disturbed, their lives never shocked by the wail and woe, the misery of degradation and poverty that has filled the Indian atmosphere. When Swami Vivekananda was in Chicago, he delivered his first lecture at the World Parliament of Religion. Obviously, he became the most popular speaker over there. And he actually ended up delivering 9 more lectures over the next 16, 17 days. In one of the sessions, he actually uses this beautiful story of the frog in the well. Now, there was a frog in the well, and he was basically born and brought up there. He never got used to life outside the well. And one day, from nowhere, a frog lands up from the sea. So the frog from the well asks the frog from the sea, "Where are you from?" And he says, "I'm from the sea." So the frog from the well asks him, "The sea? How big is that?" And he basically jumps from one part of the well to the other and says, "Is it as big as my well?" "My friend," said the frog from the sea, "how do you compare the sea with your little well?" Then the frog from the wells basically takes another jump from where he was standing. He was to the other part of the well and says, "Is your sea so big?" Then the frog from the sea says, "What nonsense you speak to compare the sea with your little well." At that point of time, the frog from the well says, "Well then, nothing can be bigger than my well. There can be nothing bigger than this. This fellow is a liar, so turn him out." Now, this has been the difficulty for all this while. We start living in our wells created by a narrow, self-centered vision, and we keep thinking that our world is the ideal world. Now, what happens is that this state of mind leaves us with a strange feeling of incompleteness, the eternal feeling of unfulfilledness, an eternal feeling of apurnata. While we are purna from within, we feel apurnata. And this apurnata, or feeling of unfulfilledness, makes us constantly go outward, constantly seeking all the things of the world. Little that we know that the fountain of bliss is actually residing inside. And the fact that we don't know that the fountain of bliss is actually inside, and we are constantly seeking things from the world, this whole thing is called avidya, or ignorance. More the ego-centeredness, more the conditioned mindset, more thicker is the cover of ignorance on our personality. And it is this covering that is trapping the infinite consciousness. A conscious and dedicated focused will over lifetimes can actually lead us to the unlocking of the Chit Jara Granthi. Now, what happens when we are trying to seek or bring forth spirituality in our lives through this mindset? No matter how much we try, no matter how much mantras we chant, how much meditation we do, how much spiritual practice we indulge in, knowledge will not seep in. Knowledge will not be, we cannot realize the knowledge because first, our minds are scattered, chitta vikshepa, and secondly, our minds are mala, means chitta mala, means our minds are impure, which also means that we are actually carrying accumulated sanskaras or impressions from multiple birth. And therefore, the solution is chitta shuddhi, which means the purification of the mind. So, the most important realization and understanding that must come into our hearts is that unless we achieve a basic level of chitta shuddhi, we will not be able to achieve spiritual readiness. And that is the foundational platform for the knowledge to seep in and the spiritual heart to be opened up. So let's understand the two critical things required for the purification of the mind, the platform for developing the higher dimension of our personality. We can do that by two ways. One, by bringing in a social orientation in our lives, and the other by basically changing the attitude and motives of our work. So when we actually kind of realter or reorient the overall purpose and motivations of our lives, we are actually capable of changing the attitude and the motivations behind our work. From selfishness to progressively becoming less selfish, more and more less selfish, and finally unselfish. How do we do that? That is basically outlined in the principles of Karma Yoga, which is in Bhagavad Gita, and Swami Vivekananda had extensively spoken about Karma Yoga in our practical day-to-day lives. So the way we can actually bring in the concept of Karma Yoga in our lives is that by how we can actually do each work by dedicating the effort at the feet of the Lord and by surrendering the fruits of the effort also to the divine. Because when we understand this simple thing that everything is God's work. Now, if not possible to kind of totally devoting this attitude, totally kind of transforming this attitude in us, even a progressive dedication to the divine extracts out one simple thing out of the equation, which is tension and anxiety. Whenever there is agentship in the work and total focus on results, there is tension and there is anxiety. There's a shloka in the Bhagavad Gita which says, Ahankara vimudatma karta aham iti mannate, which means that this ahankara and the fact that we think that we are doing the work, that aham actually brings us the tension and the anxiety. But when we actually are able to work done in the different spirit, as if it's God's work, we can actually spiritualize every aspect of our life. And when we know that everything in our life is God's work, we can actually integrate all aspects of life through one vision. At that point of time, we understand that making a cup of tea and making the presentation at work should be done with the same motivation, same motive, and the same attitude. So we also kind of reduce the difference in our avatars, the way we are at the temple, the way we are at the office, and the way we behave at our homes. And that is another very, very important dimension of our spiritual personality. Therefore, if you kind of succeed in kind of bringing in this orientation to the kind of the way we work, we will actually be able to slowly and gradually purify our hearts. Bhagavan Sri Ramakrishna once again uses two beautiful metaphors to talk about unattached work. He says, first of all, he says, do all your duties, but keep your mind on God. Live with all, with wife and children, father and mother, and serve them. Treat them as if they were very dear to you, but know in your heart of hearts they do not belong to you. A domestic help in the house of a rich man performs all the household duties, but her thoughts are fixed on her home in her native village. She brings up her master's children as if they were her own. She even speaks of them as my Rama or my Hari, but in her own mind, she knows very well that they do not belong to her. The tortoise moves about in the water, but can you guess where her thoughts are? They are on the bank where our eggs are lying. Do all your duties in the world, but keep your mind on God. And then another beautiful metaphor he talks about the fact, first, rub your hands with oil and then break open the jackfruit. Otherwise, they will be smeared with its sticky milk. First, secure the oil of divine love and then set your hands to the duties of the world. Now, let's talk about how do we bring in this social orientation in our lives? How do we bring in the spirit of service, the helping orientation, the compassion, the generosity, the humility and patience, and most importantly, the charitable mindset? Lots of times in organizations we've seen some people, they go off the block very easily, and they are the people who always volunteer to help in times of emergency. Most people are silent. In WhatsApp conversations, we've seen this. Now, today, actually, in the day and age of WhatsApp University, one thing we've realized that all of us are holding double MAs and PhDs in all subjects under the sun. So whether it's geography, history, geopolitics, sports, we kind of comment on everything under the sun, and we comment with great degree of passion, conviction, and seemingly a lot of knowledge behind the subject. But what happens when somebody comes in WhatsApp and puts in a request that this person is actually not well and needs some blood immediately, or somebody needs some urgent hospitalization, can you help? What happens? There is complete sannata in the group. Once again, there are a couple of people, two or three people always, who will come and help. Now, at the heart of this attitude of helping others is what we call the social orientation. Therefore, unless we make this habit of giving, the habit of social orientation, the habit of helping others an integral part of our lives, we are actually doing disservice to society, the community, and to ourselves. And that is the most important message of our Shastras. Another important thing that we must understand, and we must kind of internalize this, that the more we engage in fulfilling ourselves from the things of the world without giving back to the world, the more we will feel unfulfilled. The more profound will be the feeling of restlessness. So, what is our concept of charity? We basically do charity at the end of the year. We kind of donate 15,000 rupees, 20,000 rupees, 10,000 rupees to a local NGO. I've heard conversations, yeah, I donate every year to this NGO. Now, that is not the concept of charity. The concept of charity will not get internalized unless every month I set aside some money for the welfare of the public. Sri Ramakrishna, in the Gospel of Sri Ramakrishna, talks about this, and he actually emphasizes this. He says that people who contribute towards society, towards charity, their wealth will always be put to good use, and it will stay. And people who are misers, people who don't contribute for the good of society, their wealth will actually slip out of their hands. And he actually talks about four ways that wealth normally slips out of our hands: theft, medical expenses, court cases, and finally, our children will squander the wealth. Swami Vivekananda, in his advice to John D. Rockefeller, John D. Rockefeller at that point of time was a billionaire, and he was the kind of owner of Standard Oil Company, but he was very, very unhappy. He actually went to Swami Vivekananda in Chicago for advice. He told him, actually, his advice changed his life. And today, John D. Rockefeller, the Rockefeller Foundation, is one of the largest foundations in the world. He told him, My dear Rockefeller, remember, you're not the owner of your wealth. The wealth has been given to you by God. You're only a custodian of your wealth. Utilize this money to remove the sufferings of and millions of people. Immediately, you will get peace of mind. There is no other way. The purpose of life is to get peace and happiness, not to earn wealth only. So it is as simple as that. When we give, our heart expands, we experience peace, and when we hold back, our heart contracts and we experience restlessness. So we are constantly taken from the world. Even a small plate of food has a contribution of 15 people. We must understand and we must acknowledge that constantly in our lives. So if more and more people try to bring forth a little bit of the selflessness, there will be huge change in society, offices, homes, individual minds, and collective minds. Therefore, we have to understand that our minds definitely need reorganizations. If we identify with our thought world, we become slaves to our thought world. Therefore, the option is ours. Either we can make our minds a kingdom of heaven, or we can make it hell. So, if we are serious about our orientation, we're serious about our goals, we have to be serious about reformatting our minds. There's this beautiful story in the Gospel of Sri Ramakrishna. He says, there was this woodcutter who was in a forest, and after his work, he actually decided to take some rest. So he takes shelter under a wish fulfilling tree, which we call the Kalpavriksha. And suddenly he wanted some water. He said, I'm so thirsty, how I wish I get a glass of water. And suddenly from nowhere, a glass of water comes. Then he says, oh, how I wish I'm so hungry, how I wish I could get a plate of food. And suddenly from nowhere, a plate of food comes. Then he says, how I wish now I could get some siesta, if a bed can come. And suddenly out of nowhere, a bed is found. Bed comes there. And then he thinks, before I go to sleep, how I wish somebody would come and massage my feet. So some people come and kind of they do massage. At that point of time, suddenly one wicked and a negative thought flashes through his mind. He thinks, what if a tiger comes and devours me? And that very moment, a tiger comes and eats him up. So the moral of the story is a well-developed mind can be a kalpraviksha, a wish-fulfilling tree, or it can be a toxic dustbin, which means that if we give our minds constantly positive affirmations, those affirmations are bound to come true. And if we give our minds negative affirmations, those negative affirmations also are bound to come true. Now, we have to understand one simple thing. We have to understand that we are dealing with our mind in what actually happens to our minds. Basically, when a mind gets used to a particular kind of thought flow that is being repeated constantly, we are actually creating grooves in our minds. By default, we are actually programming our minds to think and act in a particular way. The tension, anxiety, stress for real and unreal situations becomes a natural state if that's the kind of thought that's flowing constantly. It becomes hardwired into your system. So we form tendencies, sanskaras, impressions, and they actually propel us to act in a particular way. So in addition to having all the sanskaras and impressions that we have got from our previous multiple births, we're actually adding to that collective pool of impressions and sanskaras. Now, to rewire the program, we have to create fresh tendencies. We have to go against the tendencies, fight it, and that is why we need a serious, conscious spiritual orientation, a conscious practice. That is why we need to be convinced first that if we have that conviction, we will actually commit ourselves to the overhauling of this mindset. It is tough, but we need that dogged persistence to push through. So we'll do a quick recap. The likes and dislikes, ego-centeredness, desires are some of the bottlenecks that pull us down. It disrupts our internal balance, intended balance. With this individual-centered life, we become instinctive, always seeking from outside. We lack the social orientation. We start living in our own worlds, own little comfort zones. With this mindset, it becomes tough to absorb the spiritual knowledge. We need chitta shuddhi. We can do that by bringing in the social orientation and changing the attitude behind our work. And to change this hardwire program, we need to reorganize our mind by creating fresh sanskaras. So here is the question. Here is the most important understanding that we need four things in our lives for a spiritual orientation: the social orientation and charity, reorienting the motives behind our work with more and more non attachment, love of God, and spiritual practice. The So what happens is that even if we do a lot of spiritual practice, a lot of regulated spiritual practice, if we don't bring in the love of God and if we don't bring in the social orientation and charity, we will actually, all our efforts will actually come to naught. Which brings back to the point that finally it is about the purification of the mind. So I'll kind of end the presentation with two last thoughts. One is a thought from Holy Mother Sri Sarada Devi. She said this few days before she achieved Mahasamadhi, and she said, if you want, and this is actually the highest benchmark of spirituality, if somebody can do this, if you want peace of mind, do not look into anybody's faults. Rather, look into your own faults. Learn to make the world your own. No one is a stranger, my child. The world is your own. And the next one is Sri Ramakrishna's advice. This actually his advice is relevant to all the people who are successful in lives, all the people who are at very senior positions in their lives. And Sri Ramakrishna actually gave this example, gave this advice to a very sincere devotee called Adhar Sen. He was a deputy magistrate at that point of time. And he said, "You are a deputy magistrate. Remember that you have obtained your position through the grace of God. Do not forget him, but remember that all men must one day walk down the same path. We stay in the world only for a couple of days. This world is our field of activity. We are born here to perform certain duties. People leave their home in the country but come to Calcutta to do work." Once again, a beautiful and simple metaphor from the avatara of this age. And lastly, what is spirituality? Spirituality is finally love in our hearts for the world, for everyone at large. Thank you, Arjun and Anjali. That's the end. And now we can actually open the session to questions and answers.
Thank you, Arijit, for simplifying spirituality and how it affects our mind. Yes, there are some questions here. And one of the questions here is, there are some habits, virtues we inherit. How can we change and control those habits? Some of these are the gene effects. Can these be reoriented?
Yeah. Yes, absolutely true. All these habits actually a combination of gene and combination of sanskaras. Most importantly, the sanskaras which you kind of inherit, and they are lodged in our subconscious as impressions and tendencies, and we can reorient them, change them by incorporating fresh habits. So if there is a negative habit that we are dealing with, if we can do a contrary habit, and if we can repeat that habit, we will actually be changing that sanskara. And also, if we kind of bring in that spiritual orientation, love of God, and we kind of bring it all together, slowly all those negative sanskaras kind of dissipate and they get burnt by default.
Thanks, Ajit. You're an experienced coach in the corporate world, right? So here I'm just going to throw a few questions. So let's do a slight workshop here, where I put in some situations down for you, and if you could tell the audience as to how. I'm sure the audience, you can also please put in your answers on the chat for these questions that I shoot up here, as to how can we handle this, so that we live simultaneously, living a physical life and the spiritual life is sort of not clashing with each other. So here's my first question to you. Though this is not a corporate scenario, but this is something that happens in every household. Yeah, you have an altercation with someone at home. You just can't stop thinking or playing that unpleasant exchange of words in your mind. How does this impact us, and what should you do?
Now, this itself, once again, this cannot be done unless one kind of evolves through a spiritual orientation, because this whole the turbulence of the thoughts coming and kind of going over our heads constantly will keep happening unless we kind of bring in the spiritual orientation. So through prayers, through a spiritual practice, slowly and slowly what happens is that we are able to bring in a certain amount of detachment from our thoughts. What also happens is that the the relationship, if a person is actually evolving truly spiritually, truly in from the spiritual perspective, the the relationship, what he expects, or he or she expects out of the relationship will change, which means that normally the relationship between a brother and a sister and a husband and a wife is typically of expectations. Love is actually also bound by expectations. The husband expects, the wife expects, the brother expects from the sister, the son expects from the father, the daughter expects from the father. It's all based on expectations. But if a person is able to transform spiritually, he or she is actually able to go beyond the expectation, which means that if you are centered in your love for God, with God's grace, you will be able to love a person beyond the conventional boundaries of the relationship. And when you're able to do that, then you're able to manifest a slightly different kind of love in the relationship, which means that when something happens to you, when you're actually on the receiving side, you're actually kind of getting a rebuke or insult, you will not get attached to that immediately, and you will pause and think and kind of not let it affect you. So initial days, it will be very difficult, but as you progress in spiritual practice, slowly and slowly you will understand that if we are able to kind of maintain the distance, we will be able to kind of reorient the magic of these relationships.
So here the lesson is do away with expectations, detach, which
Yes.
then equals to empathy, and then followed by acceptance.
Absolutely.
Am I right? Okay. Fabulous. Here,
Correct. Absolutely correct.
uh, great. Arijit, you and I come from the advertising background, yeah, where the entire world, our lives were revolved around fame and glamour and selling dreams of a material kind. Yeah. And how in an environment which is so very material and so very competitive and so very aggressive in showing a completely polished picture, and how do you in that kind of a environment or any other corporate environment where there is like absolute competition, can one still stay grounded and be spiritual?
That is actually the grace of God, and actually it can happen if one finds the spiritual path a little early in life. If we don't find the path, it is difficult. But if we find the path, we understand that we understand very very clearly that the spiritual path and the materialistic path, they are not at loggerheads. So if one is in advertising, one knows that advertising is in that's the profession that I'm doing. So when I'm doing the profession, I will kind of do my bloody best. I will kind of put in all my absorption energy into the work that I do. But because I have that larger purpose of life, about the God realization, about the purpose of human life, I will be very careful in the way I lead my life. So sometimes you have to be aggressive with clients, sometimes, and that's a part of your job. But sometimes you have to be aggressive or maybe firm with your subordinates. Sometimes you have to be very firm with people you're dealing with. But all that is a part of our work ethics. But if we have that path, if we have that orientation, you understand that both can actually go hand in hand. And you're able to stay grounded because you know that all that is happening in your life is not just your effort, but it is also the grace of the Lord. So when this realization slowly grows in your life, one thing happens is that you know that this arrogance will actually not take you anywhere, because at a very young age you actually understood that जो भी होता है ईश्वर की कृपा से होता है. ये अगर समझ आदमी में आ जाता है, if we kind of understand this, then slowly the arrogance automatically kind of leaks out of the system.
Yeah. So what I understand from you is playing that it's like a role play. You're playing that role, and you do not accept the doership, or rather, वो अर्पण कर देते हो. As whatever
Yeah,
you're
it
doing, you
is.
arpan it to the Lord as your action. Do not take any ownership of your action and continue to play the role that has been written for you.
Correct. And other thing that happens is that it is not easy to kind of develop the spirit of non-attachment early. It takes a lot of time. I'll be kind of a fool to say that I was very non-attached from the beginning. Attachment is there, and that attachment is still there. But the good thing is that there is that orientation, that what is the reality, you know. And the Swami Vivekananda says that, concentrate on the means as much as the goals. So that has been my philosophy of life. Whatever I do it very well. So my ambition always was to kind of intensely focus on the job at hand and not think too much about the result. So ambition is actually restricted to doing that particular job with tremendous amount of passion in such a way that nobody else can do it that way. I think that has also helped me a little.
Fabulous. Yeah. So, do you believe that spirituality? I mean, you just said that, but there's a question here. So, I'm asking, is this something? Do you believe that spirituality relaxes us and awakens us to the total uselessness of corporate goals and objectives? So, is spirituality and corporate goals at loggerheads? You've answered that question earlier. So, but after a point when there's this realization within, I mean, you've just answered that question saying that, you still continue to do what, what your job entails with complete passion and complete, uh, you know, what would for a better word be, not just efficiency, but with integrity. Yeah.
Yeah.
But would there be a point where you sort of start detaching with that entire, you find it, uh, there is a self detachment from this world and the happenings of the world and the corporate world, where you start to feel that, this is really not worth my time, kind of thing. So that is I think that's the next level of the question that I would want to ask.
Yeah. So now, to answer the first part of the question, that spirituality actually infuses you with more strength, first of all. So spirituality doesn't weaken you. So when you don't have spiritual strength, you actually let a lot of things pass. But when you have spiritual strength, you have the ability to resist the wrong, which means in the corporate situation, a person who's intrinsically strong, spiritually strong, and there's a difference one must bring in here of mental strength and spiritual strength. Mental strength is different and spiritual strength is different, because spiritual strength makes you strong from within. So a lot of times in corporate situations, where a person who's supposedly very strong mentally would kind of withdraw from a situation because he would be afraid, he would be scared about kind of supporting something which is right. But as somebody who's spiritually strong, he would actually have such a strong conviction in that power of goodness. If somebody has to be supported, if let's say a particular employee is not being able to come to office because he's facing a tremendous problem at home, his father is unwell, the super boss says, boss, usko bol do yaar, wo nahi ho sakta hai. But the guy who's actually his immediate boss, he's spiritually strong, he thinks, no, this guy needs to be supported. So he actually puts up a fight and says, no, sir, isko aap please give him the allowance, and he should be given 4 more days to recuperate at home. So that is how spirituality in work life also makes you far stronger. The other point is that the second part of the question is that, yeah, at one point of time when a person really evolves to that part, that stage in one's life, when a little bit of that dispassion and vairagya comes into the life, then it's a different issue altogether. But otherwise, I think spirituality actually strengthens a professional. Hello.
Can you hear me? Sorry, I'm
Yeah,
sorry. I
I can
think I
hear you.
just
Yeah.
got unmuted.
Yeah.
Yeah. So yes. So from here, what I understand is, yes, the mind moves on to a zone. When you practice spirituality, mind moves on to a zone where it just doesn't attach any emotions to the actions that are being performed, whether it is in the office or at home or in any other place. Yeah. And so that sort of helps you perform better, because then you're not looking, you look at it quite dispassionately, right? Is that what you were trying to say?
Yeah, actually,
Yeah.
yeah, so you actually you become, in simple terms, you become fearless. Though spirituality removes the fear out of the system. Most people, because see, the conviction, most people are scared of being strong. But a strong, spiritually strong person, if he has to back somebody, see, other people, most people are weak because they are actually afraid of taking a stand, because they think, oh, naukri chala jayega, kya fayda. But somebody who's spiritually strong, he thinks that I, no matter what, if there is a principle that I want to back, I will actually back that principle no matter what. So spirituality infuses a lot of fearlessness in a person, and that is actually backed by the conviction in the power of goodness.
Right. Right. There's another question here. There is this going on a spiritual path is also depends upon someone's destiny, as you mentioned earlier. And so this Pius is a little confused. He said, I find it confusing that, is it not then in our, it's not in our hands, rather it will only happen if the time comes right. So then how do you practice spirituality if it is destiny dependent?
No, it is not destiny dependent at all. It is actually the destiny. Swami Vivekananda says that if it is true that whatever has happened so far is on account of your past actions, it is also true that whatever will happen in your future is actually in your hands. In simple terms, it is a fact that we can create our own karma. So, which means that whatever we do from today can actually create our destiny tomorrow. It's as simple as that. So it is also true in a different way, that because of our sanskaras, and the time has to come. So in one way it is right that the time has to come, but for a person, who knows when the time will come? So for a person, it is important to make that effort, that you keep making that effort, and when the time comes, fruition will happen. When the time comes, spiritual readiness will happen and chitta shuddhi will happen. But till that time, you will keep making that effort.
Right, right. I think with this, Arijit, I'd like to know this. This is the last question of the evening. I'd like to know something about what you do. You've been doing a lot of introspective sessions for corporates, which has helped them in not only changing the entire, uh, not just the efficiency of the workspace, but also the the fabric or the culture of the place. Yeah. Uh, so could you tell us something about that, please?
About what one does with the organizations.
Yeah. Yeah.
So the idea is to kind of work with professionals, and what I do is to essentially help professionals find the various frameworks that we have in the Bhagavad Gita, messages from prophets like Swami Vivekananda, to kind of help them tap into their true inner potential, and kind of throw light on what are, like what I mentioned today, what are the reasons behind our minds going into a particular state. Why do we develop these bottlenecks? Why do we kind of find it difficult to kind of you know um, work in a particular way? Why do we find it difficult to deal with the insecurities, the complexities that come from within? And we do these in the forms of workshops so that people understand and people get frameworks to kind of deal with the insecurities of their mind. Because lots of times we've realized in corporate situations, lots of talented people, they come in very early, they're very enthusiastic, but they kind of burn out very early because they don't have the art of dealing with failures, the dealing with the interpersonal dynamics, dealing with the different kinds of office situations, different kinds of office politics, because they are not prepared to take the rough with the smooth. They only think that, once I've got a good degree, I've kind of come second, third in my educational career all the time. And they're actually not prepared to face the different challenges that they encounter in their corporate worlds, especially in the form of what happens to them in their minds and their in the mental zones. So idea is to work with them so that they can realize their true productive potential.
Right. That's fabulous. Follow our website. We've got videos put up there for you. We've got
So,
blog written. Yeah. Tell me.
so if anyone is interested, and they can contact me at you can my email ID and
Yeah, sure. That we would be sharing that on thing that on the chat right now.
sure.
We would do that. So if anyone would like to contact Arijit, please do look at the comment section here. We put in the contact details, or in fact, I would request you to put in your email ID as well, or you could write to us at answers.hingorisutras@gmail.com, and we will pass the message on. Yeah.
Should I give you my email ID, Anjali, right now?
Yeah, please do. Please do.
rayarijit4@gmail.com. Because I'm not being able to chat. Ray Rayarijit, rayarijit4@gmail.com.
Arijit4@gmail.com.
Yeah.
Great. Yeah. So here it is, rayarijit.4@gmail.com. If you'd like to get in touch with him for his workshops or any advice, please do write to him. Else, you can write to us at answers.hingorisutras@gmail.com, and we would connect you with him. And with that, for all who are interested in knowing more about various different spiritual concepts, please do log on to our site, hingorisutras.com, and we've got lessons for life in forms of videos, podcasts, as well as blogs, and a lot of articles there for you. And you could write to us if you have any issues understanding any concepts, or if any personal issues, please do write to us at answers.hingorisutras.com. And we also have our books where you could on the site, we've got Karma Sutra, Dream Sutra, and Guru Sutras, which explain all these concepts very, very easily and very in a conversational style, very contemporary in its language. So you're most welcome to go through those, or you could go onto Amazon and look for our books as well. Yeah. It was a pleasure, dear audience. And thank you so much. And Arijit, thank you very, very much for a very engaging session with you today.
Thank you, Anjali. Thank you, Arjun. And thank you, all the participants, for coming in and listening on Sunday, 9 o'clock. It was great. Thank you so much.